Recording in progress.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's interactive investor webinar to discuss Invex Therapeutics' clinical and regulatory strategy for Presendin, a once-a-week formulation of exenatide for the treatment of idiopathic intracranial hypertension, or IIH. Today on ASX, we provided details of our strategy, and we trust you have had the time to review these disclosures. Suffice to say, we are absolutely delighted to present this plan to you, which leads with the commencement of clinical trial applications this quarter with global regulators to commence a single phase 3 trial of Presendin for potential market approval in the European Union, UK and Australia. With the last 18 months of business activity interrupted with COVID-19 related issues, particularly in the UK, the small Invex team has achieved a significant amount of work to enable the company to commence this trial in an expedient manner. We've consulted widely, including with the world's experts in IIH, regulatory agencies and patients to formulate our clinical and regulatory plan. Joining me on the call today are my two fellow directors, Dr. Jason Loveridge, Chairman of Invex, and Professor Alex Sinclair, a globally respected key opinion leader in IIH and Invex's Executive Director and Chief Scientific Officer. Welcome, Jason and Alex. You can read about Alex's and Jason's extensive experience in their respective bios provided as part of this webinar today. For today's webinar, we would like to run through the investor deck also lodged with ASX. And following its conclusion, we would be happy to answer any questions you have on the presentation. From a procedural perspective, as an attendee, investors can ask questions via the Q&A. However, both audio and visual functions will be disabled except for the presenters. The Q&A panel will be open when you join. Select Q&A at the bottom of the pane if you wish to ask a question. Type your question in the compose box and select send. A question can be asked anonymously. We will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible, and I will tend to pull like-minded questions to frame with answers from our panel. Please note we have a hard stop at 1 hour. For any unanswered questions or further questions you may have, please feel free to email these to me at tduthie@invextherapeutics.com. I will now turn the call over to Jason, and please pause 1 moment while I share the presentation for you. Please go ahead, Jason.
Thanks, Tom. And again, from myself, welcome to our webinar and update on clinical and regulatory progress we've made here at Invex over the past period of time. Tom, next slide, please. Thanks, Tom. As a public company, you'll recognize that we have the usual disclaimer, and you can read this at your leisure after the webinar. Next slide, please, Tom. So the critical components of Invex's success are summarized in this introductory slide, and each of us will give you a small some information on some of these pieces. So in a second, I'll talk about manufacturing. Alex Sinclair will talk about clinical. I'll come back and talk about regulatory, and then Tom will finish the webinar going through the funding aspects of this update. So from a manufacturing point of view, that's summarized in the next slide. And I just want to bring your attention again to the collaboration and manufacturing agreement that we signed just over a month ago with Peptron in South Korea. This was a worldwide collaboration for the manufacture and supply of Presendin for the treatment of idiopathic intracranial hypertension. The advantage of the Peptron formulation is it's a once-a-week sustained released formulation of exenatide, which means that patients only have to self-inject once a week, which is a huge benefit for patients who will ultimately be on a treatment which is chronic in nature and will have to inject themselves regularly. So once a week provides substantial advantage over our original thinking, which was a once daily application. And I think the collaboration with Peptron is proving to be a very fruitful one. It does cover all major markets. And it provides us with a fixed dose price of Presendin and placebo for all of our clinical studies in IH, as well as an agreed price for commercial supply once the drug is approved. There are no royalties involved in the transaction, and there are no upfront or milestone payments either. So I think an extremely good deal for Invex. And in the next slide, we summarize some of those advantages of this current partnership we have with Peptron. So it's a long-term relationship that we have with Peptron, and I think at least in the initial stages, it has very significant clinical and non-clinical data package. And this data package that's provided by Peptron saves Invex probably more than a little over 12 months in time, and certainly over $3 million in studies that we'd identified we needed to do, but now do not need to complete ourselves because that data will be provided by Peptron as part of the collaboration agreement. Peptron has a huge amount of experience in manufacturing exenatide-based drugs, and they are a financially robust company and are currently investing in a larger GMP plant in South Korea to satisfy the requirements of Invex and the need for Presendin once we move into the commercial phase of our commercialization. Next slide, Tom. I think at that point, I'll pass on to Alex, and she'll give you an overview of the clinical.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, if we move to the next slide. So I wanted to start by just recapping and refocusing on idiopathic intracranial hypertension. This is a disease for which we have no licensed therapy. The incidence has gone up by over 350% in the last decade, and that's rising in line with the obesity epidemic, which means we have more and more patients needing treatment. It's a serious disease. It causes blindness, but also long-term headaches. So there's a clear unmet need, and what the patients need is an effective treatment, a tolerable treatment, and a licensed treatment, and we don't currently have these available. So the solution that Invex is bringing to the fore is to build on our preclinical data and our phase 3 data. And we now are very pleased to announce the IH Evolve study, which is a phase 3 randomized control trial. And it's bringing together our previous experience from previous IH trials. It's bringing together regulatory input from EMA and the FDA, bringing together the patient thoughts and voice, and also importantly, knowledge from key opinion leaders around the world. And now we have a real buzz of anticipation and excitement as we move towards the launch of the study. There'll be over 37 centres in the EU, UK, US, and Australia. We'll be filing a new drug application in the US. The trial will recruit 240 patients. And the drug itself, Presendin, this is a PLGA reformulated drug, as Jason was describing, from Peptron, which is a once-weekly subcutaneous injection used against placebo 1-to-1 in the trial. We're poised to put together our clinical trial committees, and we anticipate recruitment will take 24 months. The trial is designed to meet the regulatory approval for the EU, UK, and Australia, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And our outcome measures are based on our extensive preclinical work, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. So in summary, we have a trial design that we can deliver, and we have the resources and funding in place to complete this. Next slide, please. So I now want to talk you through the endpoints. The primary endpoint is intracranial pressure, and this is measured by lumbar puncture. The secondary endpoints, and at the top of these, we have a measure of visual function, the perimetric mean deviation. After that, we'll also be looking at papilledema, which is a measure of the optic nerve swelling, and also headache, monthly headache days. We'll also clearly be covering safety aspects in this trial, but there is no expedited safety monitoring as this drug is well known. Well, exenatide, the base drug, is well known and it's been well used all over the world for other conditions. So there's a wealth of safety data existing. But we will be adding in PK and anti-drug antibodies and including quality of life measures. Okay, next slide, Tom. So who will be recruited? Well, our key inclusion criteria is adults with idiopathic intracranial hypertension of both genders. The lumbar puncture pressure would be over 25 to meet the criteria for the diagnosis, and they would have bilateral papilledema. Importantly, in this trial, we will be recruiting those with visual functions suitable for medical treatment, and we measure that with the perimetric mean deviation between -2 and -7 decibels. They would also have greater than 3 headache days per week. And this is a common part of IIH. Over 90% of patients have headache at diagnosis. The exclusion criteria are those which will exclude other causes of raised brain pressure, things like excluding blood clots in the brain. We will exclude those that have had previous surgical treatments for IIH. And we would also exclude those that have other eye diseases, which would mean we couldn't interpret the visual outcome measures, or those that have taken previous GLP-1 drugs or intracranial pressure lowering drugs. This is a global trial. There'll be over 37 centres which have been carefully considered and chosen. We are embarking on more ultimate feasibility checks, but the initial feasibility is already in place. And we have a really good worldwide network of key opinion leaders at our side looking to help us recruit at these centres internationally. I move down to the statistical considerations. Well, we've had very broad statistical input, both from subject specialists, but also from specialists, global specialists and regulatory specialists. And here, one of the most important aspects is the power. And we are well powered to meet not only our primary, but also perimetric mean deviation and monthly headache days. Next slide, please. So now focusing a bit more on our choice of outcome measures. So why is intracranial pressure important? At the top left on the slide here. Well, the European Medicines Agency have primarily suggested this as a primary outcome. And why have they done that? Well, this is a measure that reflects disease activity. It's a key measure to diagnose and to monitor IIH. And this is good for us because we've already shown in our phase 2 trial that exenatide can lower significantly intracranial pressure. All of the other outcome measures reflect the clinical consequences of raised intracranial pressure. So we will be measuring primarily the physical driver for IIH. Now on to perimetric mean deviation. Well, this is a measure of visual function. And this is the most important aspect, both to doctors and the regulators. It's a really important consequence of the disease, and all doctors measure visual fields when they consult on IIH patients, and the regulators have suggested perimetric mean deviation measures. And for us, this provides us with the perimetric mean deviation, which is a well understood outcome measure, and it's been used in multiple previous IIH trials, so it's a well-trodden path. Papilledema, bottom right. Well, papilledema reflects the consequences of raised ICP. When intracranial pressure rises, you get optic nerve swelling. This is called papilledema. And this is what actually causes the visual loss. It's an anatomical measure, so the regulators do not regard it as high an endpoint as they do perimetric mean deviation, but it is an important endpoint nonetheless recognized by the regulators. And this is a technique used to look at patients all over the world in our clinics. And we measure papilledema with OCT, and it's fast and objective. And then finally, headache. So of course, headache is a really important aspect of the disease, particularly for the patients. It affects over 90% of the patients at diagnosis and is often a very chronic feature of the disease. The regulators do acknowledge its importance because it affects quality of life and because of its long-term nature for patients. So pulling all of these together, these outcome measures really reflect the ethos of the international IIH guidelines, which is firstly to preserve vision and treat vision, but secondarily to address headache. Next slide, please, Tom. So with the IIH Evolve trial, the pathway ahead is now clear. We have effectively integrated advice from number one, the regulators, secondly, the key opinion leaders and clinicians from around the world who treat IIH. Thirdly, from the previous IIH trials, we've used previous IIH data and specific subject knowledge. And finally, the patient voice. We're confident in our statistical power, and we've had a lot of input into that aspect of the trial. So we now move forward with a protocol that we can achieve approval for Presendin. And that would be the first and not an only licensed drug in the EU, UK, and Australia. And that will enable us to rapidly move the drug into clinical practice and clinical trial guidelines. Within the UK and EU, the market opportunity represents around 1 billion annual opportunity. And incorporated into the trial, we also have measures of health economics so that this will facilitate our health technology assessments post-licensing. So I hope that's been a helpful recap of the trial, of the condition and the trial, and I'll now hand back to Jason.
Thanks, Alex. We'll just quickly recap on the regulatory aspects of the decision that we've taken to proceed with the IH Evolve study for Presendin, with an intention to submit the trial data to the European Medicines Agency, the MHRA in the UK, and the TGA in Australia. So we started with a broad strategy of trying to speak widely with all of the different regulatory agencies to try and get an understanding of what their requirements would be and preferences for a clinical protocol, which would allow approval for Presendin in IH. And at the end, we've decided to go ahead with a strategy which is as de-risked as we can make it on the back of that advice, and informed by both published and proprietary IH clinical data. And this is one of the advantages of working with Alex Sinclair here in Invex, is that she's conducted the vast majority of all of the clinical studies in IH. And as such, we have a very large pool of patient data that we can use in order to inform both the protocol and the statistical assessment that's been incorporated into the IH Evolve study. At the end of that evaluation, as Alex said earlier, after wide consultation with both KOLs and with the regulatory authorities, we've selected what we believe is the lowest risk pathway. We found it difficult to actually combine all of the requirements from both Europe and the United States, and so have in the end decided to focus the trial predominantly for an application to Europe, UK, and Australia. However, the data that we will gather in IH Evolve will be used as part of an ongoing discussion with FDA in order to help educate and to help the FDA understand a little more about IH as a disease. I think one of the prime issues you have with a disease like IH is that there are no approved therapies. So as Alex said, we have a very clear competitive situation in that we have no other drugs approved in the indication or in development for this indication. The difficulty of that, or the challenge of that, is that regulators have no precedent on which to base an approval. And therefore, we have spent quite a considerable time gathering clinical data to support the endpoints that we are now proposing in part of the IH study. And we will have an ongoing discussion with FDA as we go forward, and we'll certainly present the clinical data from IH Evolve to that authority at some point in the future. I think with that, I'll pass to Tom, who will complete the presentation and talk a little bit about funding.
Thanks very much, Jason. I'd just like to recap our funding history and our current cash balance to really impart onto our listeners today that the company is sufficiently capitalized to prosecute this trial through to completion and to market approval. So our cash balance at 30 September is 32 million. Our corporate overheads for a company with a late stage asset such as Presendin remain low. So our 9 months year to date total cash outflow of 1.6 represents an average quarterly burn of just $0.5 million. And this cash runway we have currently, as I mentioned, will allow us to complete this study. But investors should take note that our investment into the study by way of signed contracts required to prosecute and complete will see cash burn increase in subsequent periods. It is important to reconfirm that no additional capital is required by the company to complete these milestones. So thank you, Alex and Jason, for your input in today's call. I would just like to summarize today's call and provide an outlook prior to Q&A. Our first batches of manufactured Presendin from our partner Peptron for the Evolve phase 3 study are anticipated in this current quarter. We also anticipate announcing the overall lead international investigator for the IAH Evolve study and also executing key agreements with service providers before the end of the year. Our first CTA or clinical trial application for this study is expected to be submitted in this current quarter. And as Alex and Jason have mentioned, this single phase 3 trial is designed to support Presendin market approvals in the EU, UK, and Australia. The data generated from this trial and the inclusion of US sites, as Jason mentioned, will inform and allow us to have continued dialogue with the FDA for future regulatory filings. As Alex mentioned, this has the potential to be the first ever regulatory approved drug for IAH in any jurisdiction around the world, and is a $1 billion opportunity, growing at around 3.4% per annum, commensurate with rising epidemic levels of obesity. So thank you for listening. Our corporate and company snapshot is displayed here. I'd remind investors that directors and management currently hold 17% of the issued capital, with the top 20 shareholders owning collectively 60%. Our enterprise value of 17 million, in our view, offers excellent risk reward for shareholders considering an investment into Invex relative to our late stage phase 3 development peers on ASX. So thank you for your time. I will now move to the Q&A. Should you have any questions, you can see both my name and also our media representatives displayed. And I will now turn to the Q&A. Just one moment. Okay, Alex, this is a question for you. Based on the work of Invex and the University of Birmingham Research Group, what does the company regard as the optimum measure of visual function? Is it PMD or is it papilloedema measured by OCT?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So OCT measures the amount of papilloedema. This is an anatomical measure. It doesn't measure the function of the eyes. And the regulators are very clear, both for advising our trial, but also if you look at the history of how they have advised other ophthalmology trials, the anatomical measures are not as important to the regulators as actual measures of visual function. Hence, perimetric mean deviation, which is a visual field measurement and a measure of visual function, is a more appropriate top secondary measure compared to the OCT measure of papilloedema, the anatomical measure.
Thank you, Alex. Our next question I will direct to Jason, which is more a commercial question. Jason, will the pricing achieved in the EU put a cap on what prices can be achieved in the US later? You're just on mute, Jason.
Someone had to fall for that one, and it was me, unfortunately. So with respect to pricing, at the moment, these two jurisdictions are priced completely independently. So the price that we achieve in Europe will not in any way influence what we achieve in the US. I think it's important to mention that within the study, we have incorporated already a range of health technology assessments. And these are important in terms of interacting with the reimbursement agencies that we will have to do so after approval. And it's that interaction and the interaction with insurers based on the clinical benefit that we bring to patients and the cost that we will save the health system in treatment of these patients, which is an incredible burden currently because of the chronic nature of the disease and the repeated hospitalizations. And I'm confident we'll achieve strong pricing in Europe and ultimately in the US.
Thanks, Jason. This is potentially directed to Alex or Jason. I think it sort of sits in between kind of both buckets. The CHMP initially indicated to Invex that they would like to monitor the effects of Presendin out to 12 months. The proposed study design considers only 24 weeks. Is there a plan for an extension study to monitor the effects of long-term Presendin over 52 weeks to satisfy EMA requirements?
Okay, so shall I start, Tom, and then maybe I can hand over to Jason. So just to be clear, the advice that we had was based on a trial design that we initially submitted that had a 12-month period of trial. We had a 6-month randomized period and then a further 6-month open label period. And the EMA came back to us and said, well, actually, we don't see any value in a 6-month open label ongoing period because there is good, well-known safety data about with the base drug exenatide, so that we don't need to do that. If we look at the previous data on drugs like Presendin and other drugs that have been trialed in IH, these trials have been much shorter. So for example, the IH pressure trial was 3 months only, and at that time point, we saw an effect of exenatide in treating IIH. And the only other large randomized controlled trial carried out by the American Nordic group was a 6-month trial. So there's a good track record of actually trialing during the randomized period a much shorter duration of either 3 or 6 months for these IIH trials. And it was felt that actually keeping patients randomized for 12 months would be unethical because you'd have patients that were on placebo for much longer than you'd actually need. Jason, do you want to add anything to that?
No, unfortunately my link cut out during the beginning, but I think you've made the key points, Alex.
I would agree. Yeah, thanks, Alex. This is a question I will direct back to Alex. Sorry, Alex. When is it anticipated that first patient dosing will commence? First part. And the second part, will there be any readouts or updates as to the patient responses during the trial or due to placebo bias? Will there be or will there be no update until trial completion? So I think the question is asking, I think, is there an interim analysis? Is there an unblinding event? Alex, over to you.
Yeah, great. Okay, so first patient is coming in the first quarter of next year, which is fantastic. And in terms of interim analysis, we will be doing no interim analysis for efficacy because the strong advice that we've had when we reviewed this with our statistical team is this would compromise the final analysis. So we won't be doing an interim efficacy analysis. We may do an interim analysis to look at our assumptions for our power calculations where we review the variability of the outcome measure standard deviations at baseline, but not an intermediate efficacy analysis.
Thanks.
Actually, I'll just add to that. Alex, just say that the study will, of course, appoint its own data safety monitoring committee, and this committee will review data from the study on a regular basis from a safety point of view. So the safety of the drug, although it's a very well established and with a drug with a safety profile that's well understood, we still have that in place. And we will report regularly on the progress of recruitment as the study goes forward. So we will keep investors up to date with the progress of the study as we move towards the full 240 patients required by the design.
Thanks, Jason. The next question, I think, ties in quite nicely to exactly that recruitment rate. What is the board's best estimate of the phase 3 trial duration to data conclusion and readout? I can give the guidance on patient recruitment over those 37 centres or 240 patients is expected to take approximately 24 months. Jason, do you have a sense of readout and unblinding of the primary and secondary measures after that date?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So at the moment, based on the feasibility we've done to date, we are expecting a recruitment time of around 24 months, which is what Tom's indicated. In any clinical study, you never really understand the rates of recruitment until you start the study, and there will be centers that you thought would do really well that don't, and others that do much better. And we will evaluate the rate of recruitment quite regularly. And we have also a list of backup centers that we can add. So if the rate of recruitment is not what we would like, then we can always add centers or add countries because we're not going into every country in this particular study. So there is an ability to address recruitment to make it a little bit quicker if we feel that's beneficial. And then once we see the conclusion of the 6-month treatment period, there is a 1-month safety washout type period at the end of that study. And then during that period, we will start to clean the databases that are being used to collect all the clinical information. And it's typical to expect that top-line data would be available around 3 months after the close of the study.
Jason, just for our listeners, by definition, the close of the study, is that the last patient recruited and completed 24 weeks of treatment?
That's right, Tom.
Great, thanks very much. The next question is somewhat of an ancillary question to today's call, but it just concerns at what point will directors be able to purchase shares on market? I'll take that one. Director purchases are clearly at the individual level, depending on directors' personal financial circumstance. It is something that no company needs to comment on in advance of any purchase. And it's also dependent, of course, on the Corporations Act and ASX listing rules, which determine that, of course, as a board and indeed anyone within the company that has price sensitive or material information is unable to trade in the securities of the organisation. And so we've been coming out of a very extensive period here, but I will just end it at that and say it is the volition of each of the directors on this call and our two fellow non-exec directors as to whether they wish to purchase shares and also they need to abide by the securities trading policy of Invex whilst doing so. The next question, Jason, I think this is maybe one for you and I. It's a question regarding a comment that investors have picked up and have certainly articulated to me. Again, this is ancillary to today's call somewhat, but it's in relation to the lawsuit by Excelligent against the University of Birmingham. And the question states as much, although Invex is not a party to this lawsuit, what risks are there to Invex if the lawsuit is successful? Jason, I can answer that, or you can.
Maybe I'll just answer it. I mean, actually, we have no information about a lawsuit between Excelligent or anybody else. We have no contact with Excelligent. We believe that the company has fully disclosed all of the risks and issues with relation to Excelligent in its original prospectus going back a couple of years, and to the best of our knowledge, nothing has changed since then. So I'm not sure there's much more to say, Tom, but feel free to comment, of course.
No, I would agree. We are not a party to this legal proceeding, and we are in no shape or form involved. Question is in regard to the IND filing, Jason, with the FDA. Are you looking, so it says here, can you clarify then, in terms of an IND filing with the FDA, are you looking at after the, are you looking at the IND filing after the IH Evolve trial now, or is there a possibility it could be filed before completion? I think we have addressed that, Jason, but would you like to just perhaps provide a comment on the difference between an IND filing and a new drug application for approval with the FDA?
Yeah, so there might be just a little bit of misunderstanding with respect to sort of terminology there. So the IND stands for Investigational New Drug Application, and the company will in fact make this probably very early in Q1 2022. So that IND is already underway, and we will make that, and we will require that IND to be approved for the study to recruit patients and treat patients as part of the IH Evolve study in the United States. And then there is an acronym called a new drug application, which is when all of the study data is complete and then a filing is made for approval of the drug in the United States. That's called an NDA. At the moment, we have no intention of filing an NDA in the United States. That will depend totally on the data we see from IH Evolve. So, you know, if we see really tremendous data from IH Evolve, we may seek approval straight through an NDA, but I think it's much more likely that having engaged over the next couple of years with FDA to sort of discuss what might come from IH Evolve and what's already available in the public data, we will be able to sort of, let's say, move that position forward and be clearer on it towards the end of the study.
And as the team has mentioned, for those on the call, of course, as an orphan drug with orphan drug status in both Europe and the United States, of course, we are not working with a precedent drug or a precedent drugs plural to help guide from those regulatory agencies. So we're, in part, it's an iterative process from us to them and then back to us to educate on IH and to educate on these endpoints, as Alex and Jason has quite rightly called out. Alex, this is I think a good question actually. This is for you. Can the trial be stopped early for futility or for overwhelming efficacy?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So as mentioned, we won't have a formal interim efficacy analysis, but as Jason was saying, there is the DMC, the Data Monitoring Committee, who have a full view of the data, although this is anonymous to us. Now, if there was overwhelming efficacy, there is a potential for stopping early. Having said that, it's highly unlikely that that would happen because usually you want the trial to complete to get all the full data. And again, for futility, it would be highly unusual, and occasionally a trial can be stopped early on safety reasons. But as we've talked about, we know that there is a very good safety track record with this GLP-1 receptor agonist exenatide base that we're using for the Presendin. So although these things are possible, I would say that it is overwhelmingly unlikely that these occurrences would have happened based on what the DMC would do.
Understood. Thanks, Alex. And another sort of comment here, which I think would be really useful for investors on this call, Alex, is sort of the leading clinician in IH globally. When you were soliciting and educating your peers on the design of IH Evolve and speaking to them as to whether they would like to participate in IH Evolve, how do you sense their enthusiasm was to what we're trying to do here with Presendin? And how enthusiastic were they in terms of wanting to participate and how they see the success or otherwise of this drug in the indication presented?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I think I've mentioned that there's been a real buzz, and this buzz has been going for a while because when the preclinical data came out on the efficacy of these GLP-1 receptor agonists to reduce intracranial pressure, this was really a really landmark piece of preclinical work that we hadn't seen in this field to date. And so the knowledge and the interest has been growing for a number of years, and that data has been presented, very widely at international conferences in the US, Australia, and in Europe. So we have a situation where our IIH colleagues who see these patients and the scientists have been watching as we've progressed this through the preclinical and then through the IH pressure phase 2 trial, which read out positive data for intracranial pressure, which was really fantastic. So having seen all of that, my colleagues around the world are certainly very excited. There is a clear need for drugs in this space. There's a clear need that these patients need not only a new drug, but a drug that's effective and that is licensed so that they can actually prescribe. And I think the COVID pandemic has actually just made this even more clear because there's been research that we've published and others showing that COVID has had a very negative impact on this condition. There are now more patients presenting and in greater need. So I think the time is really ripe to be, recruiting into a trial that's hoping to bring through the first licensed drug for IIH. So yeah, my colleagues around the world are very keen.
That's good to hear. It's always a bit of a pull as much as a push for clinical trials, and if there's a nascent pull, that all goes well for recruitment. So thank you, Alex. If there are any other questions, yep, and there's another question here that's just popped up. If you need a break, Alex, that's fine, but this is probably across both yourself and Jason. Won't the one-to-one randomization make it difficult to recruit, and why was that ratio chosen?
I can take that one, Tom. So one-to-one is important. And actually, when you start to do ratios that are not one-to-one, you start to bring in other factors into your trial design that can compromise your outcomes. And particularly when you say look at outcome measures that may have some placebo aspect to them. So we know, for example, that in the vast knowledge of running trials that have any headache outcomes, there is a placebo effect on headache, particularly with an injection. And in all of the trials that have run to date where they haven't randomized one-to-one, they have jeopardized their outcome measure because you see that patients are expecting to be more likely to be on a drug arm than on a placebo arm. And this affects the recordings of AEs, the patient's perceptions of how they feel on the drug. It compromises the quality of life measures. So because of that, it would be a very, what we felt would be a very dangerous move forward to not recruit one-to-one. And we don't think it will affect recruitment. Obviously, the patients will be fully informed through the patient information sheets, but actually we feel this is the appropriate way to do this to ensure our outcome measures are effectively analysed.
Terrific, thanks, Alex.
Mm-hmm.
That's the end of the questions showing. I do hope I haven't skipped anyone's question. I don't think I have, but if I have, please feel free to email me at the email I provided earlier, and we'd be happy to answer them. Before I turn over to Jason to just give some summary thoughts, perhaps, Jason, I would just like to thank both Alex and Jason, who are based in the United Kingdom, where it's 6 a.m. Commendable effort to get up, and also it's somewhat of I think a holiday for at least one of the directors. So thank you two for joining today's call, and Jason, I'll turn over to you for closing remarks.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks everybody for dialing into the call today. We appreciate people's interest in the company and in the study. Obviously, it's been a lot of work to get to this point on behalf of the company and everybody who works for it, as well as all of our advisors. And I think I'd like to thank them for the massive amount of work that they've done over the past 6 to 9 months. I think the Peptron agreement was a major step forward for us. We signed it less than 6 weeks ago. We've finalized our regulatory and clinical strategy, and that's what we've updated you with today. As Alex said, we will file the first clinical trial application this quarter, first patients into the study very early in 2022. And I think we're all looking forward to the start of the study and to see how Presendon proceeds in this really important clinical study. And thank you, everybody, for your continued interest, and we hope to update you again. I think our AGM is in a couple of weeks. And so we'll be back talking to investors then. And thanks again for your interest.
Thank you.